Gallup has been asking Americans now for about 2 decades to name spontaneously the most urgent health problem facing the country. What's the answer? Well, it is not a physical malady as it used to be. The most urgent health problem, cost and access to health. That's what Americans are telling us. 30% spontaneously say getting access to health care is the most urgent thing about health care today, and 25% say cost. This is a big turnabout from what we used to find. Let's go back to 1987 when we first asked the question in this format. It was AIDS. 68% of Americans at that point in the late 80s said AIDS, a disease, a problem of a medical variety, was the most urgent health problem. AIDS persisted as one of the top problems mentioned by Americans all the way up through 2000. There were some changes. When Hillary Clinton, as the first spouse, really pushed for a health care reform in 1992, for example, we found a big number of Americans saying that cost of health care was the top problem. Then that dropped off. In 1997, 1999, it was AIDS, and then cancer was mentioned quite frequently by Americans. And then starting in about 2000 and forward, we typically, in response to this question, received a lot of discussion of cost and access. There was an exception here, which is interesting. Back in November of 2001, what did Americans say? Bioterrorism. 22% volunteered that. Of course, this was just a month or two after 9/11, and also a time when anthrax was being sent through the U.S. mails, and Americans were very concerned about bioterrorism. What other problems do Americans mention now? November 2008. Well, in addition to access and cost, the third problem is obesity. 13% of Americans mention this. This is, by the way, by 1 point, the first time that obesity has, so to speak, beaten cancer as the most frequently mentioned medical problem by Americans in response to this question. Following that, very few other mentions. 2% mention heart disease. By the way, I believe heart disease is still the #1 killer of people in America today. Very few people mention that as the most urgent health problem. Only 2% nowadays mentioning AIDS as the most urgent health problem, and 2% mention diabetes. This question, again, reflects top-of-mind concerns on the part of the American public, but I think the biggest transition that we highlight in these data is the fact that when Americans think of health problems today in America, they're not nearly as likely to think of cancer or AIDS or anything else as they used to be. They're thinking about problems that Americans have getting to health care and paying for it once they get to a hospital or to a doctor. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Editor-in-Chief of the Gallup Poll.